moderator for this panel, would first like to extend a very special thank you to Dr. Gary Puckrin and to Brandon Garrett and the entire staff at the National Minority Quality Forum for assembling such a fantastic program today, and we look forward to tomorrow and the next as well. Without further ado, I am excited to introduce today's panelists. I will be providing a brief biography for each presenter, after which they will begin in a sequential order and provide remarks. We will take Q&A at the end of the session. Please, panelists, remember to keep your audio on mute until you are speaking. And then for Q&A, please place your questions in the Q&A chat box. Thank you. Our first panelist is Diane Gross. Diane is the National Director of Advocacy and Programs at the Lupus Research Alliance, where she leads the LRA's patient advocacy and engagement programs and advocacy initiatives. She has worked closely in collaboration with the National Minority Quality Forum to bring together stakeholders in lupus and experts in advancing health equity, which has generated a report entitled Addressing the Challenges of Clinical Research Programs and Participation Among Populations Disproportionately Impacted by Lupus. She has over 25 years in the healthcare arena, insurance industry, and voluntary health organizations, improving access to care, and truly is a champion of health disparities and women's health. Dr. Ashira Blazer, we are delighted, is an assistant professor at the New York University School of Medicine, Division of Rheumatology. She is also a 40 under 40 NMQF honoree. Her interests are in studying the biologic and genetic determinations of SLE, systemic lupus erythematosus. I probably pronounced that wrong, but the severity in terms of patients of African ancestry. Her current translational research project focuses on polymorphism in the APOL1 gene. We are delighted for her perspective in providing personalized treatment options to vulnerable ancestrally African patients. Susan Arundu is the Director of Clinical Operations at Lupus Therapeutics. She has over 13 years of clinical trial expertise and experience in point of care, medical systems, academia, nonprofit, and pharmaceutical industries. And before joining Lupus Therapeutics, she led clinical trials in a variety of different areas. Her health background is in informatics and project management, and we are delighted that she can join the panel as well. I will begin by turning this over to Diane Gross, who is going to start us off on the importance of advocacy in the lupus space. Diane.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Courtney, and thank you to the National Minority Quality Forum for putting on this session and organizing this panel. I'm very excited to be here and have this opportunity to talk to you all today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is lupus, just so that for those of you who may not know, we can kind of level set the conversation. The advocacy landscape, the need for some diverse participation in research, and about building community networks. So it's a lot, but we'll get through it all. So the Lupus Research Alliance, just a little bit about who we are. We're the largest non-governmental, nonprofit funder of lupus research worldwide. And our goal is really to transform treatment and advance towards a cure. And we fund innovative research and also support diverse scientific talent in order to bring new people into the field and work towards better diagnostics, improved treatments, and a cure. And Lupus Therapeutics, you'll hear more about from Susan, my colleague, is a wholly owned subsidiary or affiliate of the Lupus Research Alliance. That's our clinical trial arm. So our efforts in the research space really go all the way from bench to bedside. So we cover everything from basic science to clinical trials. So yes, lupus, systemic lupus erythematosus, it is a mouthful, and we either refer to often as SLE or lupus. So if you don't know much about it, it's an autoimmune disease, primarily impacts women, often diagnosed in those childbearing years between 15 and 44. The thing about lupus and why it's called systemic compared to other autoimmune diseases is it can impact any part of the body: heart, brain, lungs, kidney, skin, um, and obviously it is a chronic disease with organ damage accruing over time. And no two cases are alike. It's very hard to diagnose. There's no one test to diagnose it. Um, there's one approved treatment specifically for lupus that was approved by the FDA in 2011. So the treatments that people are using are really treating the symptoms and not necessarily the underlying disease. And like similar to other diseases, the treatments have their own issues, which then lead to taking other medications. So many people are on, 12 to more prescriptions a day. People with lupus often report that some of the biggest issues they have are fatigue and brain fog, and that those are sort of the most limiting symptoms in their daily life. And why we're discussing this here today is lupus impacts people of color. Epidemiological studies show anywhere from 2 to 4 times higher than Caucasian. So the prevalence of people of color is extremely high compared to Caucasians, as is the morbidity and mortality. And a recent study showed that lupus is the 6th leading cause of death for women of color, 14th when you look at women overall. But I think, what we're here today too is to talk about is there's a lot of hope, whether in research or in the advocacy landscape. So when we think about the current advocacy landscape, I think there's so much that needs to be done to help people with lupus and other chronic debilitating diseases. So at the Lupus Research Alliance, we believe that research is key, and that's where we really focus a lot of our efforts. So in about 20 years, we funded over 500 research grants, over $200 million in research grants. And I think, as many of you know, it takes a long time for research at the bench or even translational research to really start to see the results and come to fruition. And that's a lot of what we're starting to see now, is more and more drugs are going through a clinical trial process, and why it's very important that we diversify the population of clinical trials. So advocating for research funding is really one of our biggest things, and one of our big successes was getting an allotment of $5 million line item within the Department of Defense congressionally directed medical research programs. So many of you may not know that the Department of Defense does do a substantial amount of medical research funding. And so that has been really important, and it's been actually increased after 3 years at 5 million to 10 million. So we're starting to see the results of that. So as we get more people involved in research and looking at different areas, we can hopefully really learn more. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Dr. Blazer has to say about her work. But another big advocacy issue really for us is the patient voice, and bringing the patient voice into drug development. And understanding what's important to patients, because I think often we know that what's important to the patients may be not the same as what's important to physicians. So for example, for lupus, proteinuria and monitoring your kidneys is very important, but patients are concerned about the skin rashes and hair loss. So several years ago, we partnered with the Lupus and Allied Diseases Association and the Lupus Foundation of America to put on an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, and that was under the Food and Drug Administration's PFDD initiative. And we did a pre-meeting survey and got a lot of information at the meeting, and a report called Lupus Patient Voices was put out from that. And we see that continue to resonate within pharmaceutical companies and federal agencies to really help to understand voice of people with lupus. So that's been, I think, a very big success and advocacy work that I recommend in really helping patients to have their voice heard. So, and we continue to work with pharmaceutical companies to put together patient advisory boards and focus groups, and we see a lot more of that happening. So that's some very important work, I think, that we're seeing across disease states. So I think, though, an important thing too is understanding is bidirectional, and that people with lupus also need to understand the research process and why it takes so long. Like, why does it take so long for new medications to come out? So we really tried to bridge that gap and really try to bring companies together with patients so that hopefully one day we can all be speaking, the same language and be on the same page and help to advance research in that way by clinical trial design that meets patients where they are and can adapt to changes that we see in society. So, I mean, the advocacy landscape is vast. Again, we focus a lot on issues very specifically to people with lupus in terms of research, but a lot of issues around pre-existing conditions, access, prescription medicine, pricing, value frameworks impact so many. So a lot of work we do in those areas are really to work with other groups. And I was very interested in listening to some of the previous session on end-stage renal disease and hearing about the work being done on payment models there, because lupus, one of the worst manifestations is lupus nephritis, inflammation in the kidneys, and a lot of people go on to end-stage renal disease and transplants. So there's almost no area that lupus doesn't overlap with. So the need for diverse participation in lupus, as I mentioned, people with lupus have a much higher prevalence and higher morbidity and mortality due to lupus, and we need to really understand why. So there is a new scientific plan that we put out at the Lupus Research Alliance to really look at heterogeneity of disease and really understanding distinct and shared pathways among people with lupus. And I think that's one of the things that's really at the core of understanding the heterogeneity, and then the ability to stratify patients by disease mechanism in order to advance new therapeutics. And the time, I think, really is now. There have been so many advances in so many different fields, whether big data, biomarkers, and the ability to really bring that all together. And so bringing people into clinical trials is crucial, because we need people in trials who are most impacted by the disease, so that we know when treatments come forth how they will be affected and be able to recommend to doctors how to treat patients. So in all that being said, how do we do that? And I think that that's a huge quest and a big thing to tackle. So that's where we talk about building community networks, and the work that we did with the NMQF to pull together the report that Courtney mentioned. And we pulled together a group of folks into a Lupus Multicultural Engagement Partnership. And I know a lot of folks that were involved in that actually are people who attend this meeting. So it was really an effort to bring together experts in lupus with people who are experts in healthcare disparities and in working in communities, so that we can really learn. And I think you hear kind of the theme here is all learning from each other and learning together and sharing, so that we can figure out how to build community networks. Because we know, I think, that just putting materials out there and saying, oh, you should participate in clinical trials, putting out brochures, it's not enough. So how do we work within communities and build alliances? And my boss will say that Lupus Research Alliance, our name is very intentional. We are about building alliances and working together in communities and even across disease states. And as I said, lupus impacts so many organs, and the whole discussion earlier on chronic kidney disease that's very important for people with lupus. So how we can all work together. So we know one size doesn't fit all. So what we're doing now is really working on building collaborative community models to engage people, people with lupus, researchers, healthcare providers, community leaders, and we're doing that through actually another project with the National Minority Quality Forum, and we're building a lupus index. And I know earlier today, listening to Dr. Puckrin talk about using data and making actionable decisions, and using diabetes as an example to understand patient care and do predictive modeling. And what the lupus index will also help us understand is where people live, who's treating them, so we can really hone in on certain communities and work within those communities, because this is, again, I think a very resource intensive efforts that are needed in order to really bring people into considering research and building trust in communities, which I think we all know is very important. So we're really excited about all these collaborations and the potential that they bring on the data front, working with the NMQF, and really working on the macro level as well as really on the ground and working in neighborhoods with people who are at highest risk. So I hope that that was helpful and informative, and I look forward to discussion and questions at the end. And anyone who might be interested in working with us, you can put something in the Q&A and I'm happy to connect. So, thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Dr. Blazer, why don't you bring us into the moment around the clinical, the scientific foundation of the disease?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you, Diane. That was a wonderful introduction. I think some of the things I'm going to say will sort of piggyback on what you said. I don't think you can hear it enough. And then we'll kind of talk about some of the science and why it's so important to do research, especially in these underserved communities. Right, so, you know, as we said in the introduction, I am a practicing rheumatologist at NYU, and I also do quite a bit of research in lupus patients of African ancestry. So, you know, when we talk about lupus, I think the thing that's so confusing to patients and also to doctors is that lupus is probably multiple things, right? So when I explain lupus to patients, I say, all of us have an immune system. Our immune systems are supposed to protect us against viruses, against bacteria. But for some reason, in certain cases, our immune systems can start to become active against our own healthy tissues. All right. So what is your immune system? So your immune system is like a little army. It's a collection of blood cells, white blood cells in particular. And, you know, lupus has so many symptoms because wherever your blood can go, lupus can go. So if your blood goes to your skin to give oxygen and nutrients to your skin, lupus can go to your skin. If your blood goes to your heart and your lungs in order to feed blood and nutrients to your heart and your lungs, lupus can go to your heart and your lungs, okay? So this means that, you know, it's sort of this ultimate autoimmune disease, right? I think some people have heard of rheumatoid arthritis, which is just autoimmunity in the joints, or like inflammatory bowel disease, which is only autoimmunity in your gut. But with lupus, you can actually have autoimmunity in multiple places of the body. Okay, so when we diagnose lupus, the first thing we do is look for symptoms. There are 11 different criteria for lupus if you go for the American College of Rheumatology criteria for lupus. And that means that, you know, if somebody has lupus, they have to have at least 4 of these criteria. So one lupus patient could have joint disease and some rash, and then blood tests that are supportive, and then they have lupus. One person can have, you know, kidney disease and, you know, brain disease and some supportive blood tests, and they have lupus, right? So, you know, it can get a little bit confusing. And I think the other piece is that lupus is a disease of predominantly non-European ancestry people, all right? So when we think about who gets historically studied, who all of these diseases were described in, you know, most of the people are of European ancestry. And that means that when lupus presents in people of European ancestry, those symptoms become classic for lupus, right? So for example, we all hear about this butterfly rash, the butterfly rash, and that's the lupus rash and all these things, right? And it's very true that this is a very classic rash for lupus. However, many people don't have it. And in fact, people of color tend to have it less often, okay? So say you go to your doctor, you have symptoms of lupus. You don't have the classic butterfly rash. Maybe you have a different kind of rash. Maybe you have some kidney disease, right? But your doctor thinks butterfly rash, lupus, right? That doctor might miss you, okay? So we find that because the presentation is a little bit different, because there are differences in resources in people of different ancestral backgrounds, the diagnosis tends to be delayed, particularly in the people who are affected most. Okay. The other thing that I'll say about lupus in people of African ancestry and other minority populations is that it actually tends to be more severe. Okay, so there was a study that came out in 2018 looking at the top 10 causes of death in women in America. And they excluded things like accidental deaths and violence. And the authors found that in the the decades between 1524, lupus was actually a top 10 cause of death in all women. However, when they looked at African American women and Hispanic women, lupus remained a top 10 cause of death until age 44. Okay, so it was around 7 to 9, all the way until age 44. And what that tells you is that there's a big difference in how lupus affects people of color compared to other individuals, right? Why is that? I just said that lupus tends to be diagnosed a little bit later in people of minority backgrounds, and that's certainly true. The other reason is that we actually think the disease is more severe in these people. So whereas, some people may have lupus and they have joint disease and they have a skin rash, other people might have very severe manifestations such as, kidney disease, pulmonary disease, heart disease, neurologic disease. These are the kinds of things that can be life-threatening. So we find that happening more often in minority patients who have lupus. So, I think that there are a lot of challenges here because, clearly we have a disease that can present so many different ways. And in fact, it's presenting in these more severe ways in people of minority backgrounds. However, these are also the people who are less likely to be studied. So, when we look at disparities in disease, we also have to look at the research side of things, right? So in part, disparities in health and outcomes are also disparities in research and studies. And so when we look at who gets into these studies, over half of the people in lupus studies now, and this is actually progress, so over half of the people in studies about lupus are of European ancestry. However, people of European ancestry represent about a third of all lupus patients. About 14% of lupus patients who are in studies are of African ancestry. However, 43% of lupus patients are of African ancestry. So there's a huge disparity in the people who get into these studies versus the people who are affected by the disease. Okay. Now, when we all talk about why this happens, we talk about mistrust and all of these things. And I think that that is partially the case. Like, we have to understand the fact that, the medical industry in the United States, as any historic industry in the United States, has been affected by structural racism, has been even a perpetuator of structural racism. And I think that that is something that we can all be more transparent about. I think that's something that we can all talk about a little bit in a more forthcoming way, in a more honest way, so that we have the kinds of conversations that actually do foster trust. I always say the first step to gaining trust is to be trustworthy. And we have to say that our institutions in America have not been trustworthy with regard to our interactions with minority communities. The other reason that is less talked about is that honestly, the balance between the burdens and the benefits of research is not the same across population. You know, when we think about what it takes to participate in a research study, you know, you have to go to a facility that's often not in your neighborhood. You have to miss work when you may have a job that doesn't understand when you miss work. Sometimes you have to do appointments that are your clinical appointments, and your insurance has to pay for that if you have insurance, right? So if you're somebody who doesn't have access to the resources required, you actually are taking on more of a burden of this research. And then at the other side of it, there's drug development. And who says you're going to be able to afford that drug when it comes out, right? So now here you are, a person who is disproportionately affected, having to expend a lot of energy, time, effort, and have risk to your livelihood without the guarantee that at the end of the day, you're going to benefit from this study. So I think that when we think about getting minority populations involved in research, we really have to think about the ways that institutionalized racism disproportionately affects our patients. The other thing that we have to think about is, are we including ancestral populations in other parts of the world? So, you know, a lot of times when we think about why lupus is worse, the first thing that we say is, you know, genetics. The disease is different, you know, the cells are behaving differently. And I think that that's part of the story. Another part of the story is that stress, right? Stress, access, the most effective drug is a drug that you can take. If you aren't able to take your drugs, you're not going to do well, right? And so I think that when we're trying to tease out why it is that certain populations may or may not have access, and also how things are different for biologic reasons, we have to make sure that we're including patients throughout the African diaspora who are not exposed to the same kinds of stressors that our patients here are exposed to. And that way we can parse out the genetics and the biology and the environment that's precipitating worse disease. And I think and I'm not sure how long I've been talking about this. We're good. Okay, good. Okay. So I think one of the great things about like the Lupus Research Alliance and other of our foundations is that some of our international research can actually be funded more easily through foundation mechanisms rather than government mechanisms. And so as we think about bringing investigators into the fold, especially investigators in different parts of the world who might have access to ancestrally diverse populations, some of those funders are going to be especially important for progressing that work. So other things, hopefully I'll get a lot of questions in the chat. Do I have a few more minutes, or how many? Maybe one more minute. Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll leave it there, and then we will be able to have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. But I think that there's so many topics to talk about here and how we might be able to improve health for everyone studying diverse populations with lupus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blazer. Extraordinarily informative, and we look forward to hearing more about some of the research that you're currently conducting as well. Susan, let's turn it over to you to give us some light about clinical trials in lupus specifically. You need to unmute.
You have your mute on. Turn your mute off.
No, you're still muted. You need to unmute your line. Let's see. I don't know if we can have there you are.
Now, can you hear me now? Perfect. So thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Dr. Blazer. It's a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. So Diane and Dr. Blazer both touched on important aspects of clinical trials, and I'm just going to give you an industry perspective of how clinical trial design is brought to life and is brought to the point of care for patients. So what I do is I work for Lupus Therapeutics, which is an affiliate of LRA. We were established to help de-risk clinical trials in the space of lupus because we don't have too many lupus therapies currently available. So our goal at Lupus Therapeutics is to de-risk clinical trials and to offset the burden that sites have when participating with clinical trials so that their patients can have access to clinical trials that they wouldn't regularly have access to, because we work in an academia space versus the industry practice of a clinical trial space. And there are challenges working with academia, timelines, just because of how academics are set up in versus how clinical trials are set, centers are set up. So clinical trial centers are businesses for clinical trials, right? So they don't have all of the red tape that academic areas have. So that was the purpose of us getting involved in the clinical trial aspect. So what I am going to talk about a little bit, I'm going to touch on a lot of what Dr. Blazer discussed about the population in clinical trials, how clinical trials were originally set up to run and who had access to those clinical trials. And then I'm also going to talk about a lot of what Diane talked about when she discussed the importance of having minorities be a part of clinical trials. Currently, clinical trials are shifting, which is really great, right? Because they understand that having drugs available that are ineffective in certain populations doesn't really solve the problem. And we understand that the importance of working with advocacy groups and embodying what the subject or patient needs is a critical aspect of operationalizing a study design. Previously, study design was, you know, a bunch of great minds getting together and saying, we have a molecule. We think that this pathway to get this molecule on the market is ideal. So what do we need to support our idea about study design? Now the shift has been that study design, we have a molecule, right? We want to get it into the market, but what is the most feasible way to get our patients to participate in study design, the way the study is designed? And that's when we in clinical trials operationalize it. So what we do is we plan out the study, we plan out the visits, we plan out the resources to support the visits, and then we plan out the ethical processes for the site. So our current challenges are, pharma and the site and the patient speak 3 different languages, right? There are requirements that pharma has to meet. The site has their own set of requirements they have to meet. And of course, our patients have their needs. Our goal is to get them to speak the same language. We need pharma to understand the patient's burden, and then for the site to be that middle ground where both pharma and patients can come together and we can all reach the goal of having a new drug in the market. We're running into, and this is not just in the lupus space, this is an ongoing problem in clinical trials across the board. We don't have enough patients that are minorities in clinical trials. And Dr. Blazer talked about this a little bit, about how the trust is part of the problem, but also we also have identified an issue that is with our clinicians, right? We know that clinicians don't always ask everybody. And we also understand that our patients, our subjects don't know their rights, right? I mean, they don't know that they have a right to participate in a clinical trial. And because they don't have that information, they don't know to ask. And what we're trying to do is change that. We want to first arm the patients with the concept and the idea and the information and education to know that you have a right to be a part of a clinical trial if you want to, right? And then we want to encourage our PIs to ask all their patients if they want to be in a clinical trial, and not to use their preconceived ideas to decipher which person would be a good fit for a clinical trial, right? So we're trying to, overcome those roadblocks. And we're trying to incorporate that into the operationalizing clinical trials aspect. Now, another challenge that we're having with clinical trials is that, as Dr. Blazer touched on again, the resources available for the subjects or patients to be a part of a clinical trial. Clinical trials were initially set up for people who have, the time, the resources, the money to take off of work. They weren't set up for the people that need to be a part of clinical trials. Clinical trials, are considered at one time a luxury, right? And now it's essential for everyone. And we need to change that attitude, not only in pharma, because pharma understands that, we need other people in clinical trials, we need minorities in clinical trials, or we just need anyone who can benefit or participate in a clinical trial to be in a clinical trial. And how do we do that? We do it by changing how we run our clinical trials. So the first step is, not staying with the original or the standardized clinical trial site. That was one step that pharmaceutical companies are, they're using academia sites outside of KOLs, right, or key opinion leaders, right? They always use them as key opinion leaders or the face of a program, but now they're understanding that that's not enough. That's not enough participation in clinical trials, because when you have academia sites in clinical trials, you have a broader pool base versus a clinical trial site. And then also they're understanding that they don't get the chance to hear the patient voice. And because they don't have the chance to hear the patient voice, they are working with a lot of organizations like ours, to make sure that they have patient input when designing a clinical trial. And the last challenge that I think that is very imperative is the patient feedback. And we're some ways away from that, but it's critical, because the patient feedback is going to let us know how we're doing with the changes that we've implemented thus far. We have some ways to go in a lot of disease spaces, but particularly in lupus, we are far from where we need to be. And for us to close the gap and to make the leaps that are needed, we need to make sure that we're not only getting patient input at design or at feasibility, but also at the end of a clinical trial, because that is going to let us know ultimately what we've done, if it's doing good, if we need to make more changes, how do we get more people and reach our goal collaboratively, right? So that I propose, and I'm always a fan of proposing an idea for others to think with, that arming the patients, a lot of times we ask pharma to take the charge of things. And it's not that they don't have the resources or they don't have the interest, they don't have the know-how. They don't have that direct patient impact, that direct touch with the patients or the subjects. They know that there's a disease state, they know that they have a molecule, they know how to run a study. But they will not know what the patient is facing because they don't have that point of care experience. And we need to collectively get our patients and our subjects in a place where they feel that they can advocate for themselves, that they can come to and request a clinical trial, and that they have a place of, resources where they can get support in clinical trials. Through that is how we're going to be able to change pharma's idea of how to run a clinical trial. Because pharma has, their business, right? They're in the business of medicine. They are in the business of healthcare. And we can't forget the part that they're a business. And we need to keep that in mind when we're asking for things from pharma. We need to make sure that they understand that we understand what their challenge is, right? Before we give them ours. And our patients are why we're here, why we all get up here, why we're all on this panel, is because we're thinking about people who don't know how to get the help they need, or who do know how to get the help they need, but don't have the resources to do it. So my ask and my charge for everyone is that encourage people to ask about being in clinical trials, encourage them to talk about what they need to participate in that trial. And then through these changes, through these asks, we will get that feedback. And the next time, I can't promise the next clinical trial, the next 2 clinical trials, but the next time a clinical trial is thought of and being designed, those asks will come around.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate your kind of bringing it all together. And I appreciate all of the panelists who have offered such great insight into sort of disease progression, as well as sort of a baseline understanding of lupus. I wanted to take this opportunity and just offer a question to the panel before I get to the questions from the audience. And it's really about patience, because we really want to be patient focused before we even get to the clinical trial process. There are so many patients that are coming into the physician's office, and they're often misdiagnosed. The autoimmune diseases are one of those areas that are really misdiagnosed. And I have 2 dear friends who took them years to get an accurate lupus diagnosis, years. So I was going to actually turn it over to Dr. Blazer. I was like, could you just explain the misdiagnosis process and why lupus is so clinically oftentimes challenging for people to appropriately diagnose? And then maybe Diane, you could also, just kind of comment from an advocacy perspective if you're addressing that at LRA.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the most misdiagnosed diseases, unfortunately. And I think that rests with the heterogeneity of the disease, and also with the, so many people present so many different ways with lupus. And whenever I talk about the lupus symptoms, I say, there are symptoms that are related to, inflammation in a specific part of the body. So maybe you have joint pain because you have inflammation in your joints. Maybe you have a skin rash because you have inflammation in your skin. But there are also symptoms related to just having a big, bad inflammatory response. Anyone who's had a flu or, any sort of bad infection knows that you feel really tired, you feel run down, you may have low-grade fever, and all of those things are not very specific, but they are very distressing. So, when the patient comes in, they talk to you about the thing that's most distressing to them. And they say, I'm very tired. I can't do the things that I want to do. I feel really run down. And I think that can be caused by a lot of different things. Also, I think that when we think about who has lupus, it's women, and often women of color, right? And so these are groups of patients who tend not to be heard to the same extent as other patients. So I think that there are, in some ways, biases. In some ways, it's a very heterogeneous disease. And in other ways, it's just, there's no lupus test, right? So we all say, oh, the ANA is the lupus blood test. But, the majority of people who have a positive ANA don't have lupus at all. And a very small minority of lupus patients actually may have a negative ANA. So that test is not a hard and fast test that says you definitely have lupus. You really have to string together a constellation of symptoms, put it all together and say, okay, this is lupus. And then lastly, I will say that a lot of physicians are not trained well to recognize lupus. So, rheumatology is one of the segments of medicine that gets the least time in medical school. And of course, lupus is a small fraction of rheumatology. So I think that we also have to do better to make sure that our physicians, especially our primary care physicians, are aware of all of the different manifestations of lupus and when to suspect that it might be lupus.
Thank you. Diane, if you could address just that question around the misdiagnosis, and then also maybe speak to what policymakers specifically could do to better help patients, families, and their caregivers to address lupus more systemically. within our advocacy structure.
So one of the things that we often say to people who are experiencing symptoms and they just, this whole different span of symptoms and they don't know what they are, is to really think about writing all that stuff down before they go to meet with the doctor. Because as Dr. Blazer said, if my joints were really killing me yesterday, when I go into the doctor, that's what I'm going to focus on. But I may have had a fever for 3 weeks and forget to tell the doctor that, and that's really important. And it's really just everything. I mean, sores inside the mouth. So it's very important for patients to really, think about that as they're having all these odd things happen and they don't know what's going on, to really document all that. So when they go into the doctor, it helps with that discussion and to be able to explain what kind of pain they're having. So, we try and talk about that for folks that are, very confused with what's happening and, might I have lupus? And there are various tools out there. And training, medical school training, I mean, that is an issue. And we worked with the American College of Rheumatology a few years back, and then subsequently with an Office of Minority Health grant to develop a program called the Lupus Education Advancement Program. And what we learned is that if you took fellows in rheumatology to do education within their healthcare systems and to go out and talk to the OBGYNs and the ER physicians and the primary care doctors, the nurses, that doing that education within systems and helping people understand more about lupus, and then how internally, what things you need to do to help with the referral process. Because I think a lot of times what I hear that delays the process is, the lab tests have to be redone, we found that to be quite a successful program and model of education, and the American College of Rheumatology is continuing on with some of those efforts. So, our medical education system. So when you also talk about, policy efforts, I think some of it has to do really with physician training, and can we incentivize folks to go into these specialties that maybe are more nebulous or not as sexy or well paid or whatever you want to call it, and encourage folks to go into these different specialties where there's a high need, and there's data from the American College of Rheumatology showing the progression of rheumatology. We don't have enough. And then getting people to practice in places where they are most needed. So I think that's one big area where some policy efforts along physician education could help.
One question that came up, and this is both for Susan, thank you, Diane, because that was really helpful. And I want to make sure that with your expertise in the advocacy space, that we also continue to always focus on what change can we see at the policy level that helps us to mobilize grassroots communities and evoke change that benefits patients across the board. So I appreciate those insights that you shared. There was a question that came up in the chat that was speaking specifically to Susan and Dr. Blazer in terms of what barriers, given the discussion about clinical trials that you pointed out, what is your ask? Like, because of the barriers of clinical trial, what do you see as the ask of industry to include marginalized communities, vulnerable populations in clinical trials? What does that need to look like specifically so that we can actually move the needle, advance the conversation, and get to a better space and place, addressing both, Dr. Blazer, the structural racism aspect, and then Susan, you pointed out some operational challenges, right? So if you both could comment on that, maybe Susan, would you like to start us off?
Oh, I thought Dr. Blazer is on mute. So okay, so I'll start off by the question that the ask that we need to go ask pharma when we're working with them is when you are approached with a clinical trial and they give you your budget template, we need to make sure that we're asking for sufficient resources. Pharma likes to do this, $60 reimbursement for travel, which is great for some people, but for others, that doesn't cover enough. And what we're seeing is that pharmaceutical companies who work closer with foundations and nonprofits is that they understand that you can't just give people transportation to come to a clinical trial that is beneficial to them 15 years from now, right? Possibly, right? But beneficial to you almost immediately. Within two years, you have what you need, but they don't. But they've lost so much to participate. And you really need to make sure that when you're doing your budgets, that you're advocating for your patients, that you're asking for not everything, but almost everything that could prevent a subject from enrolling in a clinical trial. So we're talking about lodging, we're talking about meals, we're talking about funding for income loss and transportation and mileage and things like that. A lot of times, they're not going to offer this to you. They're never going to say, oh, we pay for all these things. What they will offer is the standard reimbursement for travel. And I know there's concerns around coercion, right? But, for a lot of phase 1 trials, they get compensated to be a part of, phase 1 trials. So that same compensation can be used across the board all the way to phase 3 clinical trials. So I would say the ask would be to adequately resource the clinical trial at your site so that you can support your subjects' participation.
Yeah, I think that those are excellent ideas. And, I also think that when we talk about clinical trials, there is one of the goals of the pharmaceutical company is to have a short time to first patient enrollment. That time to first patient enrollment is a huge metric, right? And because of that, it's easier to try and enroll patients where you have enrolled them before. So either a study site, an academic site. And so, this reminds me of one of our drugs that was approved for lupus, from GSK. There was a trial that was done specifically to enroll patients of African ancestry because they weren't powered appropriately to be able to show differences in the original study. And so this trial was supposed to run, or was supposed to enroll 800 patients. And unfortunately, only 500 patients of African ancestry could be enrolled in this trial. And so it actually ended up being underpowered again. But when you looked at the reasons why, there were no recruitment sites in a country that was majority African ancestry. A lot of the urban sites weren't able to be utilized because there wasn't the infrastructure for it. And so, we think about that time to first enrollment, and we have to understand that a lot of the places that are going to service patients of minority background are also underfunded in themselves. And so the infrastructure is not there in the same way that patients that serve institutions that serve majority patients are. And so I think that some of these partnerships with foundations, some of these community partnerships need to happen before you're trying to recruit the patients. Can we go to community physicians? Can we build a practice such that it can support a clinical trial in a neighborhood where the patients are, right? And I think that is where some of the industry dollars can go to try and make sure that we have sites that are servicing these patients. I think the other thing is that we need to make sure that we have diverse people at the interface of care. So I'll tell a very short story here. My mentor has been in the field forever. She is of European ancestry. And we were talking with her, one of the study coordinators and I were talking to her about natural hair because she wanted to, do her hair differently, right? And so we're using all of these, we're saying things like curl pattern and, how to moisturize and the oil moisture. And she has no idea what we're talking about, right? And so at the end of this conversation, we tried to ask her what we said. She had no idea. She laughed it off and moved along, right? Why did that happen? because what we were saying was rooted in our culture, right? We communicate with each other using our culture. And there are so many words and phrases and ways of putting things that were not of her culture. And so it just sort of rolled off her back and she did not remember any of it, right? This is what we do to patients. When patients are of minority backgrounds, we're asking them to come to these trial sites and we're speaking to them in a cultural language that is not theirs, right? And so there's a lot of understanding that is missed just because this whole clinical trial scientific academia language is not of their culture. So while the rheumatology workforce is not very diverse, our healthcare workforce is extremely diverse. We have nurses, we have social workers, we have all of these allied health professionals who are of the culture of the patients. We need to bring those people in to the clinical trial infrastructure so that we can speak the language of the patient, both linguistically and culturally.
I love that. Cultural communications, I think is fantastic. Diane, did you want to comment on that? I thought it was great.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example. One of the first ever patient advisory boards that we were asked to do was a pharmaceutical company who was having trouble midstream in enrolling. And so it was something, you know, there were a lot of things that they learned, but in doing the patient advisory board, one thing that always struck me is, you know, the materials they had created, every person participating in that advisory board said, I would never pick that brochure up in my doctor's office. So engaging patients and having them review materials and looking at them, I mean, makes a huge, huge difference. And so companies can work with patients early on and save time and money and ask the patient what they need. So some patients need car service, some need different appointment schedules. So we can't, you know, we generalize in order to help us, but when it gets down to that one-on-one level, you have to talk specifically to the patient. And we're piloting a program right now called Patient Advocates for Lupus Studies. So getting to some of what Ishiro is talking about is that these are people with experience participating in lupus clinical trials who have been through trials at those particular sites, who understand the language of trials and who understand the community of people with lupus, and putting them together to talk. Because one thing we've learned is people with lupus, nobody understands them more than another person with lupus, and we're seeing a lot of positive things come out of that pilot study.
Thank you so much, Diane. As we near to the end of this panel, I want to encourage all of the panelists to share a final thought with this kind of caveat question in mind. I'm synthesizing some of the questions together so that we have an opportunity to give like a final thought. What can stakeholders, we talked a little bit about policymakers, but what can national stakeholders such as the National Minority Quality Forum and other organizations that focus on the health of minoritized populations, and I want to say minoritized populations intentionally, because I think that's an important distinction. But as we spoke a little bit about cultural communications and health literacy and some of these other dynamics that are implicated with social determinants of health in terms of enrolling status and changes, what is the message for them to help advance lupus therapies, outcomes? How can they be a better voice to patients, more informed? Just give me your real quick final thought. We're going to go in reverse order. Susan, I'm going to start with you, go to Dr. Blazer, and then Diane, you can close us out.
My belief is that we should be focusing on making sure that patients understand they have a right to clinical trials and options when thinking and considering treatment. So that's the takeaway for me.
I would say that communication has to be bi-directional. I think that our patients are a source of a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of understanding of their own disease processes. And we as a community have to stop thinking of knowledge as something that we create and implement, and rather something that we do with our patients together.
So I think collaboration is key, and everybody has so many inputs coming at them, and there's so much going on out there. And we just need to find ways to collaborate, work together, and to continue getting messaging out in different ways to different audiences. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you to all of our panelists. We encourage the audience to join us for the town hall, which is coming up next at 5:30. Thank you so much to the National Minority Quality Forum for this very important convening. We wish you health and success.